A block class is not the same as a semester class just put into a different time. They're fundamentally different types of teaching. A semester system, I find, is valuable when you have a lot of little bits of information that you want to distribute ongoingly. And if you look at a calculus textbook, for example, the textbook is usually organized to be delegated in the small pieces in a semester, so you could almost say section 1.1 goes on Monday, section 1.2 goes on the next day, section 1.3 goes on the next day, and it's parsed out in this way in particular. So that's where a semester system, I think that kind of rhythm works on the semester system. The block system, though, is not about taking section 1.1, section 1.2, and section 1.3 that would have been taught over the course of a week and turning that into a 3-hour lecture. That doesn't work. Instead, what I find is better is looking at section 1 in the whole. What are the big ideas involved in chapter 1 of the book? Having those big ideas be the anchors of the 3-hour block, and then we work organically to dig deeply into those big ideas. But I may not try and get to every little bit of topic around them. For example, with calculus, I may go to the big ideas, have the students work through them, but I may not try and have them solve every type of problem in the whole field during that 3-hour block. And the reason is because I'm not trying to run them through everything you would want to know. I'm trying to give them a very deep experience of the main idea that they can recreate for themselves. I think this is probably the hardest thing I've noticed that people have from transitioning to the semester system to the block, is they try to teach what they thought was their semester course in the block system and then get frustrated when they can't get through as much material. But the point is not to get through material. That's not what the block is valuable for. The block is valuable for really digging deeply into the main questions of the course. And if you use it for that, I think it's a really beautiful experience. And the students do really well with that. So for example, in calculus, let's say you have a list of 40 topics that you would have in a semester-long course. I will look at that and I will rank what are the most important 20 topics, most important. The other 20 they can look up and we may mention them as we come and go, but I'm not trying to have them hear every single thing in the calculus book. I want them to actually do calculus and think through calculus. So I'll pick through the 20 most important problems and look at what are the main issues that underlie those 20 most important things and build the block around those primary issues that way. So we're really working towards developing the depth. One of the things that happened to me when I was first teaching on the block is I had this fear that it was like I was teaching a course and I imagined in my mind that in the back of the room was a committee of 3 mathematicians who were checking to see if I said everything right. And they were saying, you know, did you mention these things? And I would get very upset about this, like I have to say everything that's in the textbook. It took me a while to relax on that and realize that, you know what, just because I say something doesn't mean the students understand. In fact, even if I say something 5 times, it doesn't mean the students understand. When the students do something, the students understand. So I shifted my idea that I need to be saying everything about what is in the math, what is in a calculus textbook to students, and instead transition to what can I really have the students do that would have them learn this material and set the block up that way. And then I started to relax into it, and then I found teaching, not only did I find teaching more valuable, but the students remembered more material and articulated the main ideas far better than they ever had when I was trying to just say things and check them off on a list. So something I would say to someone who's transitioning to the block system is to look and see, really consider the block system not as a version of the semester system with a different time scale, but really to look at it for what kind of advantages it provides to have that long amount of time to develop on deep topics. And that requires rethinking through the classes. What are the deep topics of the course? But I think that's a really fun thing to do.
I didn't have to change too much of my content so much as the way to approach the content. So I'll give you an example. In my previous life as a regular university professor at a semester system, if I was teaching a segment on mass society and some of the ideas of, say, Emil Durkheim, or some of the sociology or political theories that come with mass society, I would stand up in front of the class and I would lecture on that. Now, I know, because I taught that for many, many years, I know what I want the students to learn. I know what aspects of mass society I want them to learn. And so I end up asking the students what they think mass society involves, and often there's at least 1, 2, 3, or 4 students who can participate, that I can ask further questions, and we can usually get at the same answer than if I was simply lecturing. I can give you an even more specific example. So one aspect of mass society is what Émile Durkheim calls, en français, anomie, a sense of isolation, loneliness, alienation. We've all experienced it. And we've all experienced it at different times, even just going to, I don't know, going to a baseball game or a hockey match where you're one of many, many people and you're doing the wave or you feel insignificant. And so I say to my students, when instead of saying Émile Durkheim uses this concept anomie and then describes exactly what anomie, and then I describe what anomie is defined at, as Émile Durkheim would have defined it, I say, well, what are aspects of mass society? And sometimes they don't get that immediately, and I'll say, well, if you're in a mass, how do you feel? What do you feel like when you're at a baseball stadium, or when you're in a giant parade, or when you're on the subway in the Montreal metro, or you're in a bus? And some of them start thinking, oh, I don't want to be around people. I want to be separated from them. I feel a sense of distance and detachment from them. And we work from there and we start talking about concepts like alienation. And then I put a name to it and I say, well, this is what Émile Durkheim described as anomie. And so I get to the same objective, but instead I have the students working themselves through that idea instead of me telling them what Émile Durkheim said about anomie. And so because I have that 3-hour block, I know that I can't just keep lecturing and lecturing to them because they would be bored and I would be bored. And so instead I have to engage them in conversation, but I have the time to engage them in that conversation. But I also realize that I can't cover what I would have covered in the lecture course because my objectives have to be different. So when I taught a seminar course, I'm sorry, I apologize. When I taught a lecture course at my old university, which was Loyola University in New Orleans, I would do a survey of political theory. And I would teach what we called Plato to NATO, or Locke to Rock, sometimes we call it, where we cover the history of political thought from one century to the next. I can't do that on a block system. There's not enough time to do all that, even in 2 blocks or even 3 blocks. So instead I have to think, what are the central themes that all of the political theorists have been interested in over the years, and use those themes as my learning objectives, and then take 1 or 2 of them and have them talk about 1 or 2 of them. So now, instead of doing that history of political thought, I'm thinking, well, maybe an important theme is democracy. What does it mean to be a democracy and democratic? What are the elements of democratic theory? I'm not teaching them what everybody said about democracy at this point. I'm asking them to maybe look at a little excerpt from Rousseau, or part of a work from John Dewey, or some work from even some of the ancient Greek philosophers, Aristotle on democracy. So we read excerpts from them, and then I ask them, well, what's significant about democracy? How, and if I get the opportunity, how has it changed? How does Aristotle in Athens as opposed to 18th century Switzerland or France?
Teaching a block system for you.
Yeah, so I've taught on the block system, the block plan, for 6 years, going in my 7th year, 3 at Colorado College and 3 at Quest. And for me, it's really a chance for the students and the professor complete immersion into the subject material. And a bit of a difference between what we'll call traditional semester-based systems and the block plan is that you don't necessarily try to cover everything that you might have a checklist for in a semester-long course. Survey courses don't work as well. The real advantage to me is that you can choose what you find are the most interesting or engaging or important topics in the subject matter and really dive into them deeper. So you might think about less is more, is one way I think of it. And in the end, it doesn't mean that you're getting less or the students are experiencing less. I would say they're experiencing as much or more than a semester plan, but you're able to direct what they're doing and have them engaged deep enough that coming out of it is a greater experience. So the whole of the block is bigger, I think, than the sum of the whole of a semester system. That's what I've found has worked for me. So the content up front, one criticism of the block plan is that there's just too much to learn in this amount of time. And so what you can do is setting up a block is you decide where you want to go with it and focus on the content that's germane to those ideas. And so the content amount comes down a little bit, but then you can expect the students to really know that content.
And when you schedule, when you try to conceive your course, what are the main or the most important thing you have to take in mind? Because that, for me, is important. What you're saying is, even at the beginning of the first week, you should have a way to
evaluate
assess, at
yeah.
some point with one of or the other form. But when you're in front of nothing there,
Mm-hmm.
is it content driven? Is it activity driven? Is it how do you manage to find the good balance when you conceive or schedule a course?
Right, so in scheduling the course, I think about a couple of things. There's the content of what is the course and what are the main things I want the students to get out of it. I tend to not worry as much about them knowing the definitions for A, B, and C. I like to think about them thinking like an earth scientist in my case, or thinking like a historian in one of my colleagues' case. So they can take that mindset and attack anything else later on with that mindset. And so I'll select a couple of projects. We might have a field project and a lab project. And so I'll schedule the course based on those projects. So they need to know just some introductory information to get started. And then what are the methods? How do we go about doing this? So there's sort of process and content. And then they take the bit of content, go through the process, and apply it to the final project, whether it be written or oral. And so what I find is selecting a few things rather than taking everything you might have had in a semester system and saying we're going to do this, this, and this, and splitting up the hours. Think about allowing the students more time to explore something and expecting more out of them from one part of the content or a couple parts of the content rather than worrying about covering all the content. Because in my mind, if you can get a student to think in the mindset of a historian or a geologist or any sort of discipline, they can then go and explore the content that may be in the book. So it's critical for me to get them to be able to think like a scientist and understand why it's done a certain way. And then also know that they don't know, I mean, there's a lot of material out there and they're not getting exposed to all of it. And it's important for them to know that so they don't come out of one class thinking, oh, I've done that. I know the history of Quebec or something after taking a one-block course. They can come out with knowing that I know how to go and figure it out. And that's the really exciting part for block for me.
My colleague here at Quest, he's taught math here for many years. And every single time he teaches a course, he teaches less content, yet he goes deeper in that content. And at first when I heard this, I thought this was very paradoxical because I thought that the job of the teacher was to tell students as much as possible to get ready for future courses. And yet he has found that by teaching less, the students learn more. And so the biggest, I taught the same course, mathematical problem solving, in February and March. And in March, although I covered less content, I am absolutely certain that the course was better received by the students because they had more time to be engaged on a smaller number of topics, but they got to such a level where they were creating the mathematics for themselves. Rather than me telling them how to do it, they took ownership of the subject in a way that I never had when I was an undergraduate, when the teacher was telling me lesson after lesson, technique after technique, formula after formula. There was no time to ask the question because the professor had no time before he or she had to give the answer. So the biggest realization that I made here on the block, here at Quest teaching on the block, is to teach less content, but then allow students the space to uncover and unpack the material themselves so that they can learn more. And that's the biggest difference that I noticed here.
I started out trying to maintain the amount of content that I had in previous classes, and that doesn't work. I was giving them full textbooks to read, and it took me a while to learn that that wasn't the best way to approach teaching a psychology class. And what I've changed now is I give them much more difficult material. I give them original journal articles. I'm giving the high school students I'm teaching right now original journal articles. So I'm giving them journal articles, but I'm teaching them how to read them. So we're spending time in class going over, how do you read a journal article? We learn how to do it in grad school. I'm asking them to do it as undergraduates, and they're getting the real material, not a textbook version of the real of somebody else's version of the material. So I go straight to primary sources. I do a lot of research methods embedded in my class. So here's a paper we read. What's the next step that you would take if you were doing this research? How would you design that? What would that look like? So it's less embedding facts in their head and doing multiple choice exams to get it back, and much more critical thinking about the world and about the material in the class, as well as having them think a lot outside the class. And I came from Ohio State, where we would have a textbook. Every lecture was a different chapter, and they were assessed using multiple choice exams that were common across 5,600 students. So that's where I trained and learned how to teach. So I totally get wanting to give them content. What I find now is that I'm giving them tools, and I'm teaching them the tools within the class, and they're also getting content on the side.
What the block system lends itself nicely to is, because I have 3 hours of class with the students every day, we can focus the entire class on just one problem. And I love that because the engagement is so intense, because they're not rushing off to another class in 1 hour, we can spend the entire 3 hours just on a single problem. And what the block system enables me as the instructor to do is, although we can't cover as much, we can go far deeper. And their students, especially for a subject like math, their confidence changes. And so just as an example, in the third day of my mathematical problem-solving class, I pose one very simple question that the students understand very easily, where the ancient Greeks knew of this concept called a perfect number. And in 300 BC, they knew 4 of these perfect numbers, but the next perfect number was not discovered until 1500 AD, 1800 years later. Yet in 3 hours, completely from scratch, just by finding patterns and having the 20 students argue with each other, debate, brainstorm, come up with ideas together, they come up with that 5th perfect number and do 1,800 years of mathematics in just 3 hours. These are first-year students, many of whom have a tremendous aversion and fear of mathematics, but they can do that because they're so deeply, deeply engaged in the subject. And they would never be able to do that, and they would not care to do that if this was just one of many courses that they were taking 60 minutes at a time over 15 weeks.
My very first year at Quest, I was really skeptical that they were going to actually pick up content. I figured that it was probably enough that we were giving them tools to learn how to critically think and tools to learn how to do research and these kind of tools. But I also wanted them to have content. So I was teaching a abnormal psychology class. and I gave them a surprise final exam that they didn't know about, because I wanted to see if they picked the content up over the course of the block. And so they didn't study for it. They had no idea it was coming. And they also weren't doing what students who knew there was a final exam coming would have done, like read their notes, prepped their notes, read over their notes, anything like that. They did surprisingly well for the content.
One thing you have to avoid is trying to telescope a semester into a block. Like if you do a course on the English novel in the 19th century and you do it over 4 months, you might have them read half a dozen novels. That's a disaster in the block. You can't read half a dozen novels in 3 weeks. You can if you did nothing else, but you want them to think about them, you want to talk about them in class, you want them to write essays about them. So you just have to change your mode of thinking. You don't do what we call survey courses, where I'm going to survey all of the 19th century, or I'm going to survey, all of chemistry or something like that. You focus on a few things that give the students the essential tools that they need to go on and read those other novels than the rest of their life. They have their whole life to read these other novels. So you'd pick 2 novels to read, and 2 novels that show contrast in author perspective or in subject matter or something like that, and teach them how to read carefully, how to analyze literature, how to write about literature. And you can do that with 1 or 2 examples. You don't need 6 examples. Now, it's great to read a dozen English novels from the 19th century. And so that's a fine way to run a course if you're running it for a year. But to me, it's not the essential thing, because they have their whole lives to read the dozen novels from the 19th century. I've read all of Dickens now, but I never read it in a class, right? And so making sure it's the skills that you're transferring.